this is Jennifer Beamer, owner-operator of Actually Dyed Art by Science, and today I wanted to show you a quick little way to take dyed wool and combine the colors together to come up with something that works well as a colorway. Have you ever heard the expression dyed in the wool? Imagine having a big cauldron bubbling over a fire, or maybe just a crock pot, and you throw in your wool with the dye, you card it up, you spin it, and you have this really nice uniform color on the other side. However, most of us like using multicolored skeins of yarn, and one of the ways that you can do this when you've got a very limited setup, where you might just have a crock pot, or you might have a space outside where you can like set up a container and then let the sun do all of the heating, known as solar dyeing. One of the things that you can do to maximize this effort is you start off with all of your wool in the container, you put in your different dyes, and then depending on how much mixing you do, you might get more like subtle muted shades, and the colors you start with might influence the final product. But one of the things that you can do in order to make a more cohesive colorway is work with a limited palette. Watercolorists know exactly what I'm talking about. Essentially, when they are coming up with a color scheme for their painting, they will often work with a limited set of colors and will mix and blend according to what their needs are for the painting to get all the shades to create the contrast in things. So when you are looking at this painting at the end, it has a very cohesive feel to it, and it's because there's only a few colors they're working with. If you're working on a painting and you suddenly drag in this color that you haven't been using from the beginning, it tends to really stick out. Now with dyeing, that might be fine. However, if you're going to be working on a bigger project, or if you're worried about how an odd color might look, one of the things that you can do is dye in this giant vat all at once. And because there is a little bit of color blending going on during this process, you're essentially creating a watercolor palette. It's kind of like the stuff that doesn't actually get onto the paper, it's all on the palette itself. So you're working with this, where all the colors are blending, but not completely, because it depends on how much water you've got there. And so at the very end, when you've dyed your wool, you might have a lock where on one end it's one color, and then on the other end it's a different color. You also might have a huge splotch of just blue. The rest of it is purples and pinks and reds, but then you have this nice blue splotch. And so one of the things that I did was, and I'll show you here in just a moment, I kind of separated out the different color themes that I wanted from this giant dye vat that I did, and then I kind of blended just those color themes together to actually come up with 3 different colors from the same dye bath that I could then use to make this little rolag, to show as an example, where I had a lot of the same kinds of oranges in the top bit as I did in the bottom bit, but because it's such blue dominant, you can't really tell, but it does look very aesthetically pleasing because I had this watercolor approach. The next thing isn't really necessary, but it's really, really convenient to have: a pair of hand cards. So if you wanted to do bigger pieces, I would suggest using hand cards. These are antique, and this one doesn't really hold together super well, but you know, it still works, and I kind of use this one stabilized against my legs, so it doesn't really matter too much. But the other thing that you could use are dog combs. If you want to have a really blended product, you don't have to, but if you do, then you'll be able to come up with something like this. Okay, so here is the wool that I'm using. It is merino that I bought years ago as a fleece. and I dyed it a variety of different colors all in the same dye bath. And you can see there's mostly blues and greens, but there's also a little bit of red. So what I'm doing here is I'm kind of assessing which colors I want to pull out. So I'm taking out this red piece, keeping it separate from this other bit, which is pale green with some blues, some white. And so what I'm doing in this next bit is finding more of this red that I want to pull out and put in a different pile. Sometimes it will be difficult to decide how to categorize which wool you want to pull out in terms of different colors. What I find helps is if you just make generalized piles of the colors that you're seeing that you really like. That way you can kind of combine or see if you want to augment with other dye batches or other types of wool or fibers. Sometimes like that piece there, there's just a little bit of red on there, but I wanted to pull it out anyway because this batch didn't have a lot of red. That one had a little bit more of that sort of grayish purpley color that I wanted to keep separate. And then I wanted to start working on a darker blue, sort of bluish purple grouping. You have to pick up the piles you've been creating to kind of see what color dominant you want it to go with, because sometimes when you start pulling out the colors they can kind of look the same. So what I was doing there was just remembering that this was the pile that had more white, and so that I grouped the piece that I had just pulled out with the grouping that I had made previously. You can also take this quite specifically if you want very dedicated groups of colors. So this pile is just blue, this pile is just pale green, this one is more yellow green, and so you can take a lot more time to pull out the locks that are dominant of those colors. However, I opted not to, just because I wanted there to be more subtle transitions rather than really big ones. So if you want more subtle transitions, you should have fewer piles with slightly more of the combination of colors. So I'm just showing you here all of the little piles that I've made and how I have chosen to divide up the colors. It's not an exact science. You kind of have to go with what you've got and see if it's working for you, and if not, you have time to make adjustments to the various piles. I have to say, it is quite unusual to think of colors in this specific way, because you kind of have to get a sense of how these colors will blend together and what the finished product might look like. So it's not as straightforward as looking at hot pink and violet and then thinking, well, when they combine it'll be sort of like a dark magenta. So these are my hand cards. You can either use these, as I said earlier in the video, you can also use dog brushes. If you have a lot of fleece, one of the things that you can do is do a test blend. So you don't necessarily have to do it all in one go. If you've got, let's say, an entire 2-pound fleece and you want to see how to blend the colors to see if you like this way or maybe you want to try a different way, then I highly recommend going through this particular step. I'm not trying to go for full color blending at the moment. I just want to see if I'm happy with this initial result. So that is the color that I produced from that little batch. Now I'm going to try another color. When you're doing this test, it would be useful to pick out the dominant colors from this grouping that you've made. If you just pick out the one color, but it's mostly dominated with a different color, then obviously it's going to alter the way that your sample looks. So in this one, I noticed that there wasn't any blue, so I grabbed a bit more to add it to the sample just so that I got more of a representation of that grouping. And then I pick one more color to work with. I really like this dark color. Another thing that you can do with this process is if you've decided to make a sweater or something equally large and you don't know how the color's going to look after you blended them together, you can do a full sample size where you use the full card, and you can test spin 2 or 3 different examples, knit them up, or do like a little test weave just to see what the result will be. And then you can rearrange your color groupings accordingly. Another thing that you can test out is seeing how they work in combination. So if you are putting this down on a drum carder, or if you're using hand cards, or if you're going to use a blending board, how you combine the colors, you can do some planning at this stage and then obviously take some notes so that it's a repetitive process. And then just lay it down on your carder according to how you want it to look. For this, I've kind of opted to do a gradient from like this orangish yellow green to pale green to dark blue, but obviously you can choose whatever combination. I probably could have arranged this in a couple of different ways and it would have turned out to be just fine. If you're sampling for a bigger project, it's important to keep notes, but also to keep samples of every step of the way so that you kind of know how you did it so that you can replicate those results. But also in the case where maybe you've had to set it down for a couple months and then you come back to it and you can't remember what things looked like, you now have a record. So I'm trying to be very careful with this, just trying to keep the cards very straight so that I pick up exactly the color. This kind of mimics the way that you blend on a drum carder. I could do this one more time and I would get a slightly smoother result, but it is fine for the demonstration purposes. We've gone from little bits of dyed wool to little samples of different color groups, and then to the final result, which is this super adorable little rolag.